Okay, so we're going to take a look at the different types of stitches. Now, this machine here, we've got 59 different stitches, and it's a lot of stitches. It's more stitches than I'll ever use, but you can actually get machines with far, far more than 59 stitches. But the other machine that we're going to be looking at has about 10 stitches or so. So the main ones I use are the straight stitch. Right up here, just looks like that. And you'll notice this one, stitch number 1, looks exactly the same, except it's moved over a little bit. So that's the only difference, is the needle is moved over to the side when you sew this. And sometimes that's helpful. So I do use that one sometimes. This is a lightning stitch. It's also known as a stretch stitch. That's something that I use. This one is the zigzag stitch. I use that pretty often. Then we've got some utility stitches in here, which are the blind hem stitch, and some of them are like an overlock stitch. We've got decorative stitches in here, and then way down here we've got a bunch of different buttonhole stitches. Okay, so I'm going to show you the straight stitch, the zigzag, the stretch stitch to start with. Okay, so straight stitch is what comes on as soon as I turn my sewing machine on. It automatically goes to straight stitch with the needle right in the middle. Easy enough. I'm just gonna, off we go. So it's got the length predetermined for just a common stitch length that's good for regular sewing. Every once in a while you want to have a longer length. And this is where we're going to change the length of the stitch. So on this machine, I can see that I've got these two numbers highlighted. I want to move this over until this is highlighted. So now I'm going to be changing the length. So I'm just going to go up. I want it to be a longer length. The highest I can go is 5. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. It actually feels like the sewing machine is taking big steps when I do this. You can kind of see the fabric moving through faster. So you can see the difference in the long stitch length. And you can make your stitch length very small as well. So let's see how we can bring it all the way down to 0, and that means the machine's not going to move at all. So that's not something we want right now. This is a very small stitch length. And that is something that would mostly be used with a different type of stitch if you were doing a zigzag stitch and you wanted the stitches very close together, so you can see how tiny they are. I would not want to have to take those ones out, that's for sure. Okay, so the zigzag stitch is often used to finish the edges of your seam of your fabric. So with these raw edges, these are unfinished edges, and if I wash this fabric, it could fray. And it can keep on fraying until the whole piece kind of falls apart. So one way to finish those edges would be to zigzag in the seam allowance. So that means I'm going to be aiming to sew in with a much smaller seam allowance. I'm going to be sewing like this. And you can see that when the needle moves into the right side, it actually goes off of the fabric. So the left side is hitting the fabric, the right side is going off the fabric. And that way it keeps it from fraying. So if I make my zigzag cross over my straight stitch, this is kind of a big no-no when you're zigzagging, because when you open up that seam, that's what it looks like. So the main thing when you're using zigzag to finish is that you're in the seam allowance, away from your straight stitch. So I'm still on zigzag stitch, and I'm going to show you a couple things that you can do to change up the zigzag stitch, which will really change how it looks. And that is changing the width and the length of it. So when I first put it into zigzag, it automatically goes to a width 5 and a length of 1.5. So we'll do that so we can see what that looks like. So it looks like that. And now I'm going to make that wider so we can see how that looks. So that's my wider zigzag. And now we'll see what it looks like narrow. gonna bring it to 1.5. There's barely any in there. Okay, so that's how it looks with different widths. I'm gonna bring it back up to 5, and now I'm gonna change the length of it. I'm gonna bring it to the longest length, which is 5. It's a stretched out zigzag. And it looks really different when you make it a small length. So you can go even smaller than 1 here. And this is sometimes used as a satin stitch when you bring it down really small. It's used in applique. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the stretch stitch, and I have some stretchy fabric here. And this is why we use the stretch stitch, is because when you're sewing with stretch fabric, if you sew with a seam that doesn't stretch, then your thread's going to snap. And I'm going to show you exactly what happens. So we're going to go back to stitch 1, which is the straight stitch, or stitch 0 actually. Okay, so I did that. It's a nice stitch, looks great, but if I pull on this fabric, snapped. That's no good. All right, so this is what's gonna happen. We're gonna move our stitch to a number 5, which is, it looks like a lightning bolt, and I call it a lightning stitch. It's a stretch stitch. Another stretch stitch is number 4, that's also stretch. And if you don't have either of those, look for the letter S on your sewing machine. It might look like this. See where it says SS? If I turn it all the way up to here, it's gonna make the lightning stitch. And if you don't have those either, number 7, the zigzag stitch, will also work as a stretch stitch. You can see it still looks fairly straight, but it's got that little lightning shape. And when I pull on this, there's no snapping of threads. Okay, let's take a look at the mechanical machine. Okay, so on this one, A is the straight stitch, and it's set up right here. You can see how that's gonna look. And I change the stitches by turning this wheel. So it's important when you're changing your stitches that your needle is up out of the fabric, because it's mechanical, it's still gonna try to change it even if the needle's down, and it could break your needle. So I'm gonna start with A, straight stitch. So that's C. And I'll probably have to adjust my length and width. For a zigzag stitch, usually I want it around 2. With the width, I'm gonna just bring it a little bit narrower, make it around 4. This is something that's easy to play with and change as you go. And I'll show you what it looks like with narrower width. Okay, so now we're gonna do the stretch stitch. So for the stretch stitch, I'm gonna keep it on A, but move this wheel all the way to SS, and that stands for stretch stitch. And that's what it looks like, but it's stretchy.